There is no silence in damnation. The moment a mortal surrenders to the caress of Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, they are broken open like a vessel spilling its essence into the abyss. What begins as a whisper of temptation grows into a symphony of hunger, each note tearing deeper into the soul, until the self is no longer the self at all. Pleasure becomes pain, pain becomes rapture, and the boundaries that once anchored a human to sanity are dissolved in waves of intoxicating corruption. And the cruelest truth of all? It is not forced. It is chosen. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are many paths to ruin, but none so beautiful, so wretched, so utterly inescapable as the fall to Slaanesh. It always begins with something small, a quiet hunger, buried so deeply in the marrow that a man convinces himself it is harmless. Perhaps it is the desire for music more intoxicating than any mortal hand has composed, or the ache for a caress that lingers beyond flesh and bone, or the whisper of ambition that burns like promethium in the chest. It begins with longing, always longing, and in the Imperium of man, longing is both forbidden and inevitable. For most, life is a cycle of deprivation. The laborer on a hive world knows only exhaustion, his ears filled with the clatter of manufacturing presses and the endless drone of the Vox speakers proclaiming loyalty to the God Emperor. The guardsman in the field knows only the rasp of his lasgun's charge pack and the iron weight of fear, waiting for the next order to advance. Even the nobles of Terra's high spires are not free, for they are caged in politics, chained by ceremony, suffocated beneath the weight of expectation. And in deprivation, desire festers. The soul twists itself toward anything that promises more than the sanctioned script of existence. That is the moment Slaanesh waits for. Not with the brutality of Khorne, not with the inevitability of Nurgle, not with the cold promises of Tzeentch. The Dark Prince waits with patience, offering not a command but an invitation. A smile glimpsed from the corner of the eye. A fragrance on the wind that no one else notices. A dream that feels sweeter than waking. It is never forced. It is always chosen, though the choice feels so small, so inconsequential, that the victim never recognizes what they have already surrendered. There was once a musician on a distant shrine world who embodies this truth. His name is forgotten, erased from archives by the Adeptus Arbits who later burned his works and silenced his memory. Yet the whispers of his fall still drift among the cultists who call themselves his heirs. He was no warrior, no heretic priest, no noble rebel. He was only a man who wanted his music to be heard. Each evening he would play in the streets, his fingers bleeding as they coaxed sound from a cracked stringed instrument salvaged from a noble's refuse. Few listened, fewer still cared, and yet he poured everything into each note, chasing perfection with a hunger that gnawed at him even in his sleep. One night, as the twin moons of that world hung low over the horizon, he heard something beneath the notes he played. A second melody, faint but undeniable, like a voice singing along with him in a register no human ear should have discerned. It filled his veins with fire, every chord vibrating inside him until he felt as though his heart would burst from the rapture of it. In that moment, the silence of the world mocked him. He needed others to hear it, to understand it, to share in what he had touched. That need became obsession. He began to practice not for music but for revelation. His fingers blistered and split until they resembled flayed meat. He played until the bones in his hands ground against one another. Every nerve alive with agony and ecstasy, entwined so closely he could no longer tell one from the other. Listeners began to gather, not because the music was beautiful but because it was disturbing. It scraped against their souls, awoke needs they had buried, unsettled them in ways they could not explain. He did not notice their unease. He only heard the echo of that hidden voice, the chorus beneath the sound, urging him on. And so it is with all who first taste Slaanesh. It might be music. It might be flesh. It might be the pursuit of perfection in battle, the endless sharpening of skill until the blade is no longer a weapon, but an extension of the self. It might be the hunger for recognition, for applause, for eyes to see and mouths to speak the words one craves. It does not matter the path. What matters is the moment when desire ceases to be a part of life, and instead becomes life itself. When a man no longer eats for sustenance but for taste. When a woman no longer paints for beauty but for obsession. When the warrior no longer fights for duty, but for the exquisite ecstasy of the kill. This is when the soul begins to turn, whether the mortal admits it or not. The musician played on day after day until sleep became a stranger to him. His neighbors reported strange sounds from his dwelling at night, tones that no instrument should produce, harmonies that vibrated through walls and into the marrow of their bones. Some swore they heard laughter within the chords, a laughter at once joyous and cruel, as though mocking the frailty of mortal ears. By then it was too late for him. The first taste had sunk its hooks. What he once sought for joy, he now pursued out of compulsion, and he could no more stop playing than he could stop breathing, Slaanesh had noticed. The Adeptus Ministorum teaches that sin begins with thought, that heresy is not only in the act but in the whisper of temptation that precedes it. Yet in the shadows of the hive spires, in manufactorums reeking of sweat and promethium smoke, in barracks where guardsmen drink themselves half-blind between deployments, temptation is not an intruder. It is a companion. Every man and woman who lives in the Imperium carries a hunger they are forbidden to name, a desire they are forced to bury. It is in that burial that rot begins. The musician, now captive to his own sound, had ceased to live as men live. His body grew gaunt, flesh stretched thin over aching bones. His lips split and raw from whispered prayers he did not realize he spoke. When his fingers bled, he bound them not with cloth but with wire, tightening it until pain sharpened the music. The neighbors who once listened in curiosity now avoided the narrow street where his notes spilled like poison into the air. But there were always a few who lingered. The desperate, the curious, the lonely. They felt something awaken in them when they listened, something their priests and overseers had told them must never be awakened. They felt alive. Whispers spread that the musician's melodies could stir emotions long thought dead, could inflame desires one dared not name aloud. A woman who had lost her child claimed she heard her daughter's laughter inside the chords. A broken guardsman swore he relived his first battlefield kill, his lasgun humming in time with the music. The Adeptus Arbits came once, warning him to stop, but the magistrate who led them stood too long outside his door listening, his expression half ravished, half terrified. They left without enforcing their decree. The first taste spreads not only through the victim, but through all who draw near like a contagion without cure. And yet, the musician was not unique. Across the galaxy, countless others take that same first step in different guises. On a forge world, a Magos biologist pierces deeper into living flesh than any sanctioned experiment allows, seeking perfection in the union of machine and sensation. On a battlefield, a champion of the Astra Militarum begins to crave not survival or victory, but the exquisite thrill of each perfectly timed strike, savoring the heat of blood spraying across his face. In the silken chambers of a noble house, A scion with too much wealth and too little meaning turns to pleasures forbidden, finding in them the only moments that feel real. Each believes themselves in control. Each believes the indulgence is theirs alone, but in truth, the moment desire is fed without restraint, it ceases to be mastered. It becomes the master. That is when Slaanesh leans close, unseen, unheard, yet undeniable. The Dark Prince does not drag mortals into damnation. He waits for them to walk willingly into his embrace, craving more with every step, until they no longer remember the path they came from. The musician's decline reached its fever when he no longer played for an audience, no longer even for himself, but for the unseen presence that seemed to breathe along his neck as he bent over his instrument. He could feel it now, close and intimate, like a lover's touch against his spine. His blood on the strings made the tones raw and piercing, so sharp they rattled teeth and set the air vibrating as though the walls themselves wanted to sing. When exhaustion finally forced him into half-conscious dreams, he saw a figure of impossible beauty waiting in the dark, neither male nor female, neither wholly human nor entirely alien. Its voice sang with his, urging him to play again. He awoke weeping with joy, though he could not say why. One night the street outside his hovel was filled with listeners. They did not know why they had come, only that the sound had pulled them like moths to flame. The music lashed them, caressed them, tore at their nerves and soothed them in the same breath. Some fell to their knees, shuddering as though in rapture. Others clawed at themselves until their nails split. Overwhelmed by sensations they could neither endure nor escape, the musician played on, blind to them, deaf to anything but the harmony he shared with the unseen figure in his mind. This was the first true surrender, not of his body, though that was already broken, nor of his mind, though madness had already taken root. It was the surrender of the soul, the moment he ceased to distinguish between himself and the voice he served. From that instant he no longer played for perfection. He played for Slaanesh. The Ministorum would later denounce him as a heretic, his works burned, his listeners executed or lobotomized into servitors. But destruction of the flesh cannot undo what the soul has tasted. Those who had heard his music carried the hunger with them into death, their last moments filled not with prayers to the God Emperor, but with a yearning for more. That yearning is the truth of Slaanesh, that once the first taste is taken, it can never be forgotten. And so the first step becomes the only step that matters. A soldier takes pleasure in victory too deeply. A worker hoards the smallest luxuries with too much devotion. A noble whispers the wrong prayer into the night. None of them see the trap. None of them realize that the path to damnation does not begin with a leap, but with a taste so sweet that once swallowed, the soul will never again be satisfied. The descent of the musician, though remembered by cultists in hushed reverence, was only one among countless echoes scattered across the stars. Yet his story embodies the moment when indulgence ceases to be indulgence and becomes identity, when the thirst for more tears through every boundary until the soul itself is dragged screaming into the abyss. The Imperium teaches its children that excess is a chain, that only restraint can keep humanity from the jaws of the warp. And the priests are right, though not in the way they mean. For the chain does not shackle the mortal to Slaanesh. It shackles them to themselves, and when that chain snaps, they fall willingly into the waiting arms of the Prince of Excess. The musician's last performance came not in a hall or a shrine, but in the ruin of his own body. His neighbors found him after days of uninterrupted sound, his hands worn to bone and sinew, his eyes sunken yet wide with feverish joy. He sat in darkness, lit only by a single guttering lumen, the air thick with the copper tang of blood and the sour reek of sweat. His fingers, stripped of flesh, still moved, dragging across strings that glistened with his own lifeblood. The melody was unbearable, a shriek that seared into skulls, but beneath it was something transcendent, something beautiful beyond mortal reckoning. Those who heard it either fled in madness or fell prostrate, sobbing with desire. It was no longer music. It was worship, and then came silence. Not because the musician had stopped, but because the sound had shifted to a register beyond human ears. The listeners felt it rather than heard it. A trembling in their nerves, a resonance in their bones, a pulse that seemed to align with their hearts until their own blood was part of the song. They collapsed together on the stone floor, writhing, moaning, lost in sensations they could not name. In that moment, they were no longer merely witnesses. They were initiates. The musician died that night. His body was found slumped against his instrument, his lips torn, his chest hollow as though something had clawed its way free from within. The Arbites burned his remains. The Ministorum declared him an example of the wages of excess, and the Voxcasters spread his condemnation across the hive. Yet what they failed to understand was that the death of the flesh meant nothing. The first taste he had shared lingered in the hearts of those who had listened. Some killed themselves within days, unable to endure the emptiness of silence after such ecstasy. Others disappeared into the underhive, forming the nucleus of a cult that still plays his forbidden notes in the dark. The taste had become a hunger, and hunger never dies. This is how corruption begins across the Imperium. It does not always wear the guise of music. Sometimes it is found in the battlefield cry of a warrior who realizes the act of killing is not horror but exhilaration, that each strike of the bayonet sends a rush through his veins more potent than any sanctioned stim. Sometimes it lies in the hunger of a noble for adoration, who drinks deeper of flattery until the words of servants are no longer enough, until only worship will sate him. Sometimes it is the painter who finds her hands trembling when she creates something too vivid, too obscene, too alive, and instead of recoiling, she craves to paint more. Each path is different, but the destination is the same. For Slaanesh does not seize by force. The Dark Prince waits until mortals offer themselves freely, until they mistake damnation for fulfillment, until the act of indulgence becomes indistinguishable from life itself. Only then does the veil lift. Only then does the truth emerge, and the truth is this: the first taste is never the last. Once the soul has been opened, once the senses have been awakened beyond the pale boundary of mortality, nothing in the Imperium can satisfy again. Faith feels hollow. Duty feels cold. Even survival feels meaningless. Only the pursuit remains, the endless hunger for more, for higher peaks of sensation, for deeper wells of indulgence. That pursuit is the true corruption. It drives men to break oaths, to betray comrades, to abandon the Emperor's light for the shadows of the warp. The musician's story is whispered in cult gatherings not as tragedy, but as scripture. They say his soul did not die but was carried into the arms of Slaanesh, where his fingers were made whole again, where his song continues forever in the endless chorus of the Dark Prince's palace. They say his final performance was not an end but a beginning, that every scream of desire in the galaxy is another note in his melody. Whether this is truth or only the fevered dream of heretics cannot be known, but the fact remains. Once the first taste is taken, there is no return. This is why the Inquisition burns whole hives for whispers of Slaanesh. This is why the Ministorum preaches restraint, not as virtue but as survival. They know that desire, once fed, will never again be satisfied. They know the first indulgence is the last moment of freedom a mortal will ever have. After that, they belong to Slaanesh. And so Chapter 1 closes not with a scream but with a whisper. The whisper of temptation, the whisper of indulgence, the whisper of a taste that becomes hunger, and hunger that becomes worship, and worship that becomes the soul's undoing. The first taste is always sweet. It burns in memory like a forbidden fruit, a recollection that grows sharper, brighter, more intoxicating each time it is recalled. The mortal believes themselves free. They imagine they can step back at will, that the indulgence was only a momentary lapse, a fleeting experiment. But the truth is that the chain has already been clasped around their soul. They have already taken the collar of Slaanesh upon their necks. The links may seem light, even invisible at first, yet with every indulgence the chain grows heavier, the collar tighter. What begins as a choice soon becomes necessity. Desire is not patient. It is not static. It grows, it evolves. The noble who first demanded more flattery now craves outright worship. The warrior who once thrilled at victory now hungers for carnage without end. The artist who once painted for beauty now yearns only to capture horror. Each indulgence builds upon the last, raising the threshold of satisfaction higher, until nothing but the most extreme excesses can provoke even the faintest flicker of pleasure. This is the curse of Slaanesh. The chains of desire never slacken, never loosen. They only draw tighter, dragging the soul further into bondage. In the spires of Necromunda, there is a tale whispered among the underhive scum of a merchant prince who began his downfall with something as small as wine. The vintages of his house were already famous across a dozen sectors, but his tongue grew weary of them. He sought rarer bottles, stranger flavors, vintages brewed with herbs from death worlds, liquors distilled from the ichor of alien beasts. At first he celebrated his growing cellar as a sign of wealth and refinement. Yet when his stores ran dry, he found himself restless, pacing, trembling with thirst he could not quench. His servants told him he would drink nothing but the most exotic blends. They were right. Ordinary water turned to ash on his tongue. Common wine became poison. Only the most forbidden intoxications brought relief. When his trade coffers finally failed to meet his obsession, he began to drink from darker sources. The blood of slaves mixed with narcotic dust, the liquefied organs of captured xenos, the distilled essence of chem slums where nothing grows but rot. The merchant was no longer a man of luxury. He was a slave bound to his own thirst. This is how the chains of desire tighten, slowly, link by link, until one day the mortal wakes to find they no longer command their appetites. Their appetites command them. Inquisitorial records are filled with testimonies of such chains. One confessor spoke of a guardsman under his care, a decorated veteran of 3 crusades. At first, the soldier's glory was earned through skill and bravery. But the thrill of battle was not enough. He began to seek wounds, to feel the heat of last burns and the tearing of flesh until he could no longer fight without first spilling his own blood. He sharpened his blade on his own arms before every battle. He licked wounds clean of dirt and powder to taste the salt of pain. In the end, he marched not for the emperor but for the sensation of agony itself. His brothers in arms feared him more than the enemy, for he rushed into fire with the laughter of one already possessed. When the confessor confronted him, the soldier whispered, "I do not fight for victory. I fight for the moment of the blade entering flesh. That is my emperor now." He was executed within the hour, but his words remain carved into the confessor's memory. Such are the chains that bind the servants of Slaanesh. The mortal believes they are choosing each step, that they are pursuing freedom, that indulgence is liberation. But liberation is the cruelest lie of all. For each link of indulgence tightens the collar until there is no escape. Until every breath, every heartbeat, every thought belongs not to the self, not to the Emperor, but to the Prince of Excess. The chains glimmer like jewels. They feel like velvet. They sing like a chorus of angels, but they are chains nonetheless. And once worn, they are never removed. Across the Imperium, the chains of desire manifest in forms as diverse as humanity itself. The subtlety of Slaanesh's bondage lies not in one universal temptation, but in the countless ways each soul can be ensnared. For the noble it may be adoration, for the soldier violence, for the artisan perfection, for the wretched, even hunger can become a key that opens the gates to damnation. Each begins with something seemingly harmless, but each ends the same. The soul yoked to an appetite that can never be satisfied. Among the high-born courts of Terra itself, there are stories of nobles who fell into the prince's grip through the most delicate chains of all: praise. At first, a lady might smile when her courtiers compared her to saints and goddesses. She might commission a portrait, a song, a tapestry in her honor. But soon the compliments grow stale, like wine left too long uncorked. She craves fresh words, fresher worship. Her retainers are beaten if they fail to find new ways to describe her beauty. Her servants scour archives for ancient poetry to recycle as her praises. Her guests are compelled to kneel, to cry her name, to chant her virtues until their throats bleed. Yet even this fails. The noble's ears grow deaf to anything but the loudest, rawest screams of worship. In time, her palace becomes a temple not of stone saints but of living throats, shrieking her name in endless cycles of devotion. And still she is not satisfied. The chain is complete. She is no longer mistress of her people but a slave to their voices, her existence defined entirely by the cacophony of flattery. The soldier's path is cruder, but no less binding. A veteran may begin with the joy of victory, the rush of surviving one more charge, of holding the line when all seemed lost. But soon the thrill of triumph is dulled. He seeks greater foes, bloodier battles, more desperate odds. He begins to crave the moment of impact, the spray of blood, the scream of the dying. What was once discipline becomes addiction. Entire squads have vanished into the warp after following such a commander, their comrades drawn into his insatiable hunger for carnage, until their battlefield becomes a shrine to slaughter. The Inquisition calls these war cults, but in truth they are simply slaves. Slaves bound by chains they cannot even see. Artists are perhaps the most tragic prisoners of desire, for their chains are forged not in the flesh but in the mind. A painter may begin with beauty, portraits of saints, depictions of heroes, still lifes of serene landscapes. Yet the more she paints, the more she glimpses flaws. No brushstroke is perfect, no color true enough, no canvas wide enough to contain the vision clawing in her skull. So she paints again and again and again, each work bolder, more frenzied, more obscene. The forms twist, the colors bleed. Her subjects writhe upon the canvas as if they suffer the torments she herself feels. When finally she collapses before her masterpiece, she does not see horror. She sees perfection. Her brush has become her chain, each stroke binding her deeper to the whispers that guide her hand. Her art is no longer her own. It belongs to the dark prince. Even among the destitute, desire binds. A starving hive scum may sell scraps of his body for a loaf of corpse starch, believing himself clever for surviving another day. But survival is no longer enough. He begins to crave the transaction itself, the thrill of barter, the risk, the humiliation of selling that which should never be sold. His hunger becomes less for food and more for the sensation of feeding, until he eats filth, poisons, even ashes, not for nourishment, but for the perverse satisfaction of devouring. When his belly swells with rot, when his body crumbles with sores, he still gnaws and swallows, shackled not by hunger, but by the insatiable compulsion to consume. The chains differ, yet they are one and the same. Each binds tighter with every indulgence. Each steals more of the soul with every link. What begins as choice ends as servitude. Mortals tell themselves they are free, that they indulge because they wish to, that they can stop whenever they desire. But this is the cruelest lie of Slaanesh. For the chain is not fastened from without, it is forged within. Each link is a heartbeat. Each clasp is a thought. Each tightening of the collar comes not from some demon's hand, but from the mortal's own. And when at last the chain can grow no tighter, when every breath is enslavement and every indulgence is agony, the final revelation dawns, that the chain was never a chain at all. It was always the mortal's true self. Slaanesh did not create their bondage. He merely revealed it.